Mr. President, welcome to Moscow. Your official visit is happening in the context of major regional and international transformations. What has changed for Damascus? Is Syria about to start a new chapter? Can we say that your meeting with President Putin on March 15th was a landmark event?
Maybe not a landmark event, but it was an important meeting, since Damascus is an integral part of the world. Damascus influences the world, and the world influences Damascus. So the question is, what has changed in the world in recent years? The coronavirus pandemic has brought major changes to our lifestyle, politics, economy, interests, and shifted the balance of power. Then the war in Ukraine began, bringing even bigger changes. We live in a changing world. The importance of this visit is based on the fact that Russia and Syria share approaches to the world that affects us every day.
Which specific issues did you discuss with President Putin? Syria is dealing with the aftermath of a devastating earthquake. Syrians had enough problems already, and then the earthquake happened on top of everything. What economic and political aspects did you discuss with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin?
As for the political aspect, life will not wait for us, so to speak. If we don't discuss everything, if we don't form our mutual position and a plan of action in time, things will happen fast, and the national interests of Syria and Russia will suffer. When we talk about wars, blockades, or earthquakes, the economic aspect plays the key part. Discussing economic repercussions of disasters is very important. That's why, during this visit, we focused mostly on the economy, and it was a comprehensive, inclusive, and substantial conversation, especially when we discussed specific projects. The visit was scheduled before the earthquake, but the timing is right, considering the larger political context that includes the Turkish issue and other aspects, as well as our economic partnership and the situation with Syria's economy.
Speaking of sanctions, some of them were lifted after the earthquake in Syria. What do you need now in order to rebuild Syrian cities after the disaster? Are there specific numbers yet? Syria had been living with the conflict for 12 years, and then the earthquake happened. I'm guessing the numbers will be astronomical.
You are right. Our preliminary estimate is that Syria will need more than $400 billion after the war, and it's just an approximation. The final number might be higher, because we still have areas that are not controlled by the Syrian government. We need $50 billion to deal with the aftermath of the earthquake. Again, this is also an approximation, since we haven't yet calculated the damage to residential and government buildings or infrastructure. We need more time to get the final number, but the damage that has been done to buildings and infrastructure by the war and earthquake has more than a material dimension. We have to look at the economic damage as a whole. The economy suffered more than anything. Going back to your question about what's needed to rebuild the country, sanctions haven't really been lifted. A specific exception was made for certain humanitarian aid deliveries. However, in order for our economy, our industries and trade to grow, we must have access to various products and necessities that people in any country need. Nothing has changed in that respect, but Syria will be able to recuperate after the war and the earthquake even without this type of help, because we have all the resources. The problem is that this process is more complicated now and the cost is higher. Despite everything, there is progress. Unfortunately, we see it only in certain aspects, like electrical energy, for example. What does Syria need? It needs the blockade to end.
So the West is lying when it says to the media that sanctions have been lifted so that the Syrian people can get help, and it doesn't matter if their area is controlled by the Syrian government or not. Is this political hypocrisy?
Every aspect of European politics is built on lies, and the West lies about Syria as well. If you don't lie, you can't represent the West. And I'm not exaggerating. We have dealt with many problems over the years, even when the relations between Syria and the West were good. Even then, there were lies and hypocrisy on the part of the West. And now the same is happening with the Ukraine conflict or any other crisis. European countries lie. They want to show off their humanity, but it is all fake. They want to look good in the way they are dealing with the earthquake aftermath in Syria, so that nobody could call them inhumane, but they never delivered any aid to Syria.
Turkish cities have also been devastated by the recent earthquakes. It's no secret today that there is a continuous effort to normalize whatever is possible in the relations between Damascus and Ankara. This disaster has affected both Syria and Turkey. Could it perhaps give a push to this process and help the two countries overcome some disagreements and perhaps overlook some things? Isn't it time to do this?
Overall, I don't think our two nations have any disagreements. The problems are caused by the Turkish politicians, who have their personal ambitions that they seek to pursue by waging a war in Syria. That's how it was when this war started, and it hasn't changed until today. So to answer your question, I can see that the only earthquake that could effectively change Turkey's foreign policy and encourage the Turkish leadership to look for a dialogue with Syria under the current circumstances is the presidential election in Turkey. There is nothing else.
Right. Also, there have been reports recently about your pending meeting with President Erdogan, mediated by Russia and Iran as part of the Astana process. It is well known that in politics, there are no conflicts or alliances that last forever. Are you ready to meet with President Erdogan?
What are Syria's goals in this case? Syria's main priority is to have all the illegally deployed foreign troops removed, and that concerns mostly the US and Turkish troops. They are the only troops illegally deployed in Syria. Another thing Syria needs is to cut all support to terrorist groups such as Tahrir al-Sham, al-Nusra Front, and the likes of them. It doesn't matter what they call themselves. They have one founder that bankrolls them all. Turkey's latest proposal involved a four-lateral meeting at the top level of deputy foreign ministers, and yet they didn't propose any agenda for this meeting. So no condition and no expectations. So why do we need to go? We didn't set any conditions, despite the fact that they are trying to tout in the media that Syria is refusing to go and setting some very demanding conditions. The issue of foreign military presence on our territory had been raised before, and nothing has changed since. It is a matter of our sovereignty. It's not a political issue. We are not accepting the invitation to the meeting because we don't understand what the meeting is for, why we need to go. That's the problem. We're trying to obtain a clear agenda.
So Syria is not going to participate in the meeting of deputy foreign ministers scheduled in Moscow. Is the meeting cancelled?
Our position is that either we receive a clearly defined agenda for this meeting, or in its absence, we are only prepared to talk about the withdrawal of Turkish troops from Syrian territory.
Mr. President, if the conditions are met and Syria's position is taken into account, will you be prepared to meet President Erdogan prior to the presidential election in Turkey on May 14th, or rather after it? The meeting of Presidents Assad and Erdogan is believed by many to have a potential to greatly influence the outcome of both the presidential and parliamentary elections in Turkey, and the date of such a meeting is of big importance. Are you ready to help President Erdogan gain some points before the election?
For two parties to meet, they need to have some common interests. For Turkey and its president, the election is the priority and nothing else. Everything else is secondary. For Syria, restoring our sovereignty and having foreign troops removed from our territory is the priority. Do these priorities align? They don't. If they did align, if withdrawing Turkish troops could secure President Erdogan a new presidential term, both parties would have no problem. But so far, we don't see any common ground, since the interests of the two parties in question are not aligned. That is the problem.
Does this mean that the meeting could still take place?
Of course, if the conditions are met, and Syria's condition is to be free of foreign military presence, so if these conditions are met, we won't even wait for any particular date. We will be ready to meet today or tomorrow. There are no logistical problems with organizing this meeting. It can take place as long as this priority condition of ours is met.
What is your take on the domestic situation in Turkey? The Turkish opposition seems to be more open towards Damascus and its vision than the ruling Justice and Development Party.
From the very start of this conflict, we have been trying to never become a player on Turkey's domestic scene, regardless of our agreements or disagreements with any of its domestic actors. It would be wrong to make our national interests hostage to the political games of another country. First and foremost, because it's another country and we do not take part in any of its political processes. And secondly, because that would disparage our national interests that are our ultimate priority.
The Turkish defense minister said that the presence of Turkish troops on Syrian territory is not an occupation, as you call it. Ankara expects Damascus to understand its position on Kurdish groups. Do you understand the Turkish government's concerns about separatist and nationalist movements that threaten the national security of both Turkey and the Syrian Arab Republic?
And if it is not an occupation, then what is it? It turns out we invited them to Syria for a visit? What is the rationale here? I don't know which law he relies on in this case. If he turns to the first laws, even before the Code of Hammurabi, or to contemporary laws, he will not find anything to support his case. Unless he turned to the Roman laws, created at a time when countries defined their borders on the basis of their military power. Perhaps in his mind, he lives in that era. As for their concerns, he is not even telling half-truths, but the opposite of the truth. I wish he were brave enough to admit the truth, which is that before the war, since 2000 or even 1998, there were no serious issues on the Syrian-Turkish border. We had the Adana Agreement, mutual understanding, cooperation, and almost complete consensus on the issue of security. He should have had the courage to say that the current security problems are caused by Turkish policies, especially Erdogan's policies. They are the ones who created what we have today. They have two major challenges right now: security and refugees. Both of these problems have been created for Turkey by the Justice and Development Party under Erdogan's leadership.
You mentioned the Adana Agreement. Doesn't that agreement justify Turkish presence in Syria? They claim that this presence is for their own national security in the region, which is in line with the agreement. There may be disagreements over the distance, but the agreement is still there.
First of all, this agreement has not been ratified by the parliament. There was a security agreement, to be legally precise. Secondly, the agreement talks about chasing terrorists 5 kilometers deep into Syria across the border. There was no pursuit of terrorists because the situation in Syria was good. The state controlled the borders. There was an army, police, and security forces who did their duty. Therefore, there was no need to be guided by the clause, and the clause was not invoked. In essence, they justify their actions by a problem which they have caused themselves.
Going back to the question about the Syrian Kurds, has the visit by United States Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley to northeastern Syria changed the way you view Kurdish militias? Have they become for you just like ISIS, al-Nusra, or Jabhat Tahrir al-Sham? My question is whether you have severed all ties with the Kurds, and has Mark Milley's visit, which you may well describe is illegitimate, alienated the Kurds from you?
For me, this visit did not have a direct bearing on the way we view these groups. First, this visit showed that it is the United States, rather than the country it accuses, that is the world's biggest rogue state. The Americans are second to none in terms of how often they violate international law. This visit violated the sovereignty of another state and therefore constituted a violation of international law. As for the groups you mentioned in your question, we need to avoid laying all the blame on the Kurds, since there are Arabs serving in the People's Defense Units and the Syrian Democratic Forces, too. Most of the Kurds are patriots, although considering the situation in these regions, as well as the fact that the pro-American groups control these territories, prohibiting or restricting any patriotic activity, one cannot fail to get the impression that most of the people there are not patriots. I suggest that we treat anyone working with the Americans as a foreign agent, which is self-evident.
Can we discuss regional developments too? What do you think about the Saudi-Iran deal to normalize relations and restore diplomatic ties? What impact will it have on the developments in and around Syria? We often hear that the Iranian presence and influence alienate Syria from the Arab world. Today, the two countries reconciled. How will this affect the situation inside Syria?
We were pleasantly surprised by this reconciliation. We can also call it a meeting held with China's good offices. Talks and contacts started several years ago, and they chose a good moment to announce their reconciliation. At the same time, this also means that Syria is no longer an arena for Saudi-Iranian confrontation. There were several instances when this was the case, and this was the way various parties viewed the situation in Syria before. In fact, Saudi Arabia changed its attitude towards Syria several years ago, when it stopped its attempts at interfering in our domestic affairs or supporting various groups here. As for all this talk of severing Syria-Iran ties, this topic has become irrelevant several years ago. I think that there is a general understanding of what these relations represent. Mutual trust has been underpinning relations between Syria and Iran for 4 decades now. If we cannot stay true to our existing friends, how can other friends and brothers that we have expect us to stay true to them? I think that this is no longer a problem for the Arab world. This is our position on this matter.
In your opinion, how will this agreement affect the developments in Lebanon? This country has always served as a testing ground of sorts for regional agreements. Today, there is a push to back Souleymane Frangieh to become Lebanon's president. Do you believe that the Saudi-Iranian deal can help Lebanon overcome the immense challenges it faces today?
We all influence something or somebody while also being subjected to outside influence. Of course, this influence can be both negative and positive. It is also clear that the entire region, as well as Syria and Lebanon, stand to benefit in various ways from a deal like the one between Saudi Arabia and Iran or any other agreement. We can say that overall, the deal will definitely play its role. However, we have yet to see how it will influence the situation specifically.
The media suggested that Israel stands to lose the most from the deal between Riyadh and Tehran. Aren't you afraid that Tel Aviv will continue shelling the Syrian territory in order to destabilize the region? Each time they shell Syria, they claim to be targeting Iranian militias, the Iranian positions, or Iranian ammunition warehouses. Aren't you afraid that the Saudi-Iranian deal will make Syria a legitimate target for Israeli air forces?
Israel has been doing this all along and has never stopped. It tries to throw the region into confusion every now and then. It all started back in 2013, when the Syrian army was about to succeed in its efforts to defeat terrorist groups. In 2014, it also happened against the backdrop of Syria's successes. Today, whenever we achieve something in our counter-terrorist efforts, Israel wakes up, launches its strikes, or starts working with these groups. It has never abandoned its policy of messing up the cards. On the one hand, Israel is an enemy, while on the other hand, it is a quasi-state rooted in terrorism. So it is quite natural for it to find itself on the side of terrorism.
What is Israel's endgame as it continues to shell Syrian territory? Just recently they attacked Aleppo International Airport, where humanitarian aid for earthquake victims was coming. Maybe Russian officials told you something about this?
These actions seek to weaken Syria. None of this has anything to do with Iran or anything else. The Israelis are well aware that most of the targets are Syrian targets. These targets have nothing to do with Iran.
This year's Arab League summit will be held in Saudi Arabia. Will you attend it if you are invited? What can you say about the tentative visit of the Saudi foreign minister to Damascus, as well as the possible visit to Syria by the King of Jordan as the head of an Arab delegation or contact group? How do you feel about such potential actions by Arab countries? Would you welcome a delegation from Saudi Arabia in Damascus?
So far, the Arab countries have just put forward a number of ideas and proposals. We do not have anything concrete at the moment. How will it all evolve? We will see. We are waiting for an action plan to resolve the Syrian crisis. As for possible meetings with Arab or non-Arab states, we have not broken off relations with any Arab states. On the contrary, the Arab countries severed their relations with Syria. We do not believe that severing relations is, in principle, the right political action. Naturally, we are in contact with every state, including the non-Arab countries that have severed relations with Syria. This is our principal general position. Now, please remind me what the first half of the question was about.
Will you attend the Arab League summit if you are invited?
The Arab League Summit. Regarding the Arab League Summit, I would like to say the following. Syria's membership in the Arab League has been suspended. So before Syria can participate in the summit, its membership in the Arab League must first be restored. But that issue alone requires a summit. Actually, we came up with our stance even before the recent summit in Algeria. We share it with the Algerian foreign minister during his visit to Syria on the eve of the summit. We also informed the other ministers who visited Syria in February in the wake of the earthquakes. We informed them all that returning to the Arab League for the sake of membership is not the ultimate goal for Syria. Our common goal is ensuring concerted action by all Arab states. Syria can only return to the Arab League when the Arab League overcomes its internal divisions and starts to take consensus-based decisions.
It could take 1,000 years for the Arabs to reach a consensus.
Well, then we will wait for 1,000 years. But this is our principled position. Like I said, returning to the Arab League is not an end in itself for Syria. Why go back if all you'll get is people saying, oh, they're back?
But just a meeting between you and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, could be a game changer for the region.
Fair enough, but that's a different matter. When we talked to the Algerian foreign minister and other Arab ministers, we informed them that Syria will return to the Arab League only after consensus is restored there. Another condition for our return is the return to proper bilateral relations. If we don't want Syria to be a battleground for settling other nations' scores, we need to build good bilateral relations with every Arab country. So I don't think that conditions are right, as yet, for Syria to return to the Arab League.
Now for my second to last question. Mr. President, you have arrived in Moscow at a time when Russia is essentially locked in a fight against all of NATO in Donbass. Around the world, these developments are referred to as the war in Ukraine. In Russia, we call it the special military operation. What does this confrontation mean for Syria? Some say that American influence in many parts of the world has started to dwindle. Recently, we have seen China step up as a mediator between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Is this the beginning of a multipolar world order?
The multipolar world is gradually taking shape. It's going to be a long process. The West, and especially the US, has been engaged in an existential war for years. Yet it is true that American influence in the world has been slowly diminishing. But let's be real. This doesn't mean that the United States is no longer a global superpower. That said, when Donald Trump became president, the US, which used to be the strongest player on the global market, started losing its power. On the one hand, the US chose to remain open economically, but on the other hand, it also tried to clamp down on China's tech companies in America. This is evidence that Washington no longer considers itself the ultimate superpower.
Before, we used to criticize Donald Trump. Now that we have Joe Biden to deal with, it seems like Trump was a saint compared to him.
That's right. What's even worse is that now it's not the American president or the US administration that make all the decisions, but a group of lobbyists with their own interests. They used to have absolute control over global markets. They enjoyed hegemony in politics and other areas. But now it is slipping away from them. America's greatest weakness is its own currency, the dollar. Once the dollar is no longer at the top of the economic food chain, the balance of power in the world will shift, giving way to a multipolar system. However, should the dollar remain dominant, the world will stay unipolar, even if there is some multipolarity in the political or military sense.
Mr. President, in conclusion, I'd like to ask you one final question about President Erdogan. We know that President Putin is working hard to be a mediator between Syria and Turkey and to figure out some kind of a diplomatic solution. Did you discuss that with Mr. Putin in the Kremlin? Did he offer any guarantees that Turkey would withdraw and return to its borders if Syria moves ahead with the normalization effort? Again, that would help Erdogan score some points just before the election. What did President Putin say to you on the subject?
No, I did not receive any guarantees. Given Erdogan's behavior, perhaps the reason for that is that no one can guarantee what Erdogan will do next. With Erdogan, you can't plan ahead, even for a couple of days. The man is constantly switching between policies. It's almost like a vicious circle. So I don't believe that any world leader could put trust in Erdogan's guarantees.
The latest change in his policy has been for the better. He said that he is willing to be open towards Syria, willing to let the refugees back in. That could carry a positive message.
But are his promises built to last? The presidential election is just around the corner. What will Turkish politics look like after the election? Nobody knows. It is all temporary, fleeting, no real commitment. What you described is just a short-term tactic designed to achieve Turkey's goals and not Syria's. In fact, there is no one in the world we could ask for guarantees right now.
President of the Syrian Arab Republic, Bashar al-Assad. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.